In criminal law, the burden of proof rests on the state. The prosecution must present evidence heavy enough to tip the scales beyond reasonable doubt. Under the Sexual Offences Act, securing a conviction for rape requires the prosecution to satisfy three interlocking statutory elements. First, they must prove sexual intercourse occurred. Second, the complainant did not consent. And third, the defendant did not reasonably believe the complainant consented. This structure works when both parties are able to testify. But establishing consent and reasonable belief becomes difficult when a complainant is physically unable to communicate their state of mind. This evidentiary problem is the focus of the 2007 Court of Appeal case R v. Zheng. Mr. Zheng was accused of raping an ex-employee in a hotel room. The complainant testified she was highly intoxicated, slipping in and out of consciousness. When a witness is asleep during the act, the prosecution cannot rely on their direct memory to prove a lack of consent. Section 75 of the Sexual Offences Act provides a mechanism for this absence of direct evidence. Rather than requiring the state to produce evidence of an unconscious person's inner thoughts, Section 75 applies a legal presumption to the known facts. Normally, a jury determines facts based on raw evidence. A statutory presumption differs because it dictates that if certain conditions are met, the jury is required by law to assume a specific conclusion. The Zheng appeal highlights how easily a trial can fail if a judge misstates the type of presumption Section 75 creates. The law must protect incapacitated victims while maintaining the defendant's right to challenge the state's case. We can map the logic of Section 75 using this model. The process begins when the prosecution proves a triggering fact, that the complainant was asleep or unconscious. They must also prove the defendant knew the complainant was in this state. Once those facts are established, the statute dictates the second element of rape. The complainant is taken not to have consented. It also applies to the third element. The defendant is taken not to have reasonably believed there was consent. This allows the state to bypass the need for affirmative evidence regarding the victim's internal psychological state at the time. If the legal process stopped here, the defense would have no way to contest these assumptions. However, Section 75 includes a qualification. These elements are assumed only unless proven otherwise by the defendant. This makes Section 75 an evidential presumption. An evidential presumption shifts the burden of producing evidence. If the defendant can point to evidence that contradicts the assumption, the issue must be decided by the jury rather than the statute. This is different from a conclusive presumption. A conclusive presumption is a rule of law where proving fact A mandates the legal conclusion of fact B, regardless of any other evidence. A conclusive presumption changes how the burden of proof functions, exempting the prosecution from having to prove that specific element to the jury. In a rape trial, if a presumption of non-consent were conclusive, the defendant would be unable to argue that consent actually existed. This brings the focus back to Mr. Zheng's conviction in the lower court. His defense team appealed on the grounds that the judge's instructions to the jury were legally flawed. They argued that the trial judge severed the unless proven otherwise pathway in his directions. They claimed the judge told the jury to find a lack of consent based solely on the fact of unconsciousness, treating Section 75 as an absolute rule. If a jury is told to treat an evidential presumption as conclusive, the prosecution's burden is lowered, making the conviction unreliable. The Court of Appeal reviewed the transcript to determine if the judge's words misled the jury. Appellate courts apply a precise standard of review to jury instructions to ensure they accurately reflect a statute. They do not look at individual sentences in isolation to find technical mistakes. Instead, they evaluate the instructions based on the total impression left on the jury. Lady Justice Hallett delivered the final judgment on behalf of the Court of Appeal. The court examined how the trial judge phrased the requirements of Section 75. They found that while some individual sentences were imprecise, the broader context of the summary was legally sound. The review looks for where the burden of proof ultimately rested at the end of the judge's summary. Lady Justice Hallett concluded, "In our view, the jury could have been in no doubt whatsoever what they had to decide. Namely, had the prosecution proved so that they were sure that the complainant did not consent." The key was that the judge emphasized that the prosecution had to prove the lack of consent, so the jury was sure. This specific emphasis corrected the earlier errors in the judge's direction. By reminding the jury of the state's ultimate burden, the judge preserved the rebuttable nature of the Section 75 presumption. As a result, Zheng's appeal was dismissed and his conviction was upheld. This outcome clarifies that Section 75 allows for a legal assumption, while still permitting the defense to present a rebuttal. Despite upholding the conviction, the court issued a warning to trial judges. Lady Justice Hallett noted that judges should consult with counsel when framing these directions to avoid giving grounds for an appeal. Trial judges must keep the distinction between a rebuttable assumption and a final legal fact clear. Section 75 is an effective tool for cases involving incapacitated victims, but its application depends on trial judges correctly explaining its rebuttable nature.